So I'm going to talk about what happened when I decided to go gradeless in my undergraduate courses. And this was kind of influenced by the pandemic and how I chose to respond to students really panicking over the huge shift in teaching, learning, and where and how they showed up. So the first thing I want to do is ask you, what is the worst grade you ever got? And I'm going to put this in the chat, if I can find it here. Okay. There you go. This is just a poll. Laura already has told us that she got an F, and that is awesome. So D's, F's, C's. I'm going to share the results here on straw poll. Okay, so we have lots of C's, lots of D's, lots of F's. Okay, so oh my goodness, whose worst grade was an A+? Wow. That is incredible. So yeah, like people are reporting here that their teacher made a big deal out of it, and they, you know, some people would have gotten an F, but they had to, get pushed through. So lots and lots of C's, D's, F's, right? So, and here we all are. We're academics, right? And we've made it, right? So here we are. Clearly that didn't have such a huge impact on our life going forward. So I want to talk about why we need grades, right? So why do we need grades? Why do we need to give our students grades, especially in undergraduate courses? Well, students need to go to grad school, so we need to give them grades because getting into grad school is competitive. We need to give them grades so that they can prove that they knew stuff, that they learned stuff. Students want to know what their GPA is. I have a 17-year-old who is still in high school, and she's constantly calculating her grade point average. So students want to know their GPA. It's fun. They want to know where they stand. And grades motivate students, right? Students want to know what they're getting. They kind of have that sense of competition, and they want to build that. And then a lot of people would argue that grades are a fair way of representing learning, showing that students learned something, and demonstrating that. But really, none of these are good reasons for having grades. None of them. They're all silly reasons for having grades. Why do we need to care about assessment and grades? We need to care about how we assess students and how we give students grades, or how students earn their grades, for reasons of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Grades don't always reflect what a student learned. And grades don't always reflect where a student started and where a student finished, right? Like everyone has a different starting point and a different end point in a course. And grades really don't reflect effort. Somebody could get really lucky and work less than someone who worked really hard. Grades usually don't reflect much creativity. Like there's exceptions to this, of course, but when there's a right answer, a grade generally isn't a creative process. So we really need to reflect on how we recognize how people learn and how they reflect or communicate that learning. So my question for myself was, if I'm going to do go without grades, if I'm going to ditch this whole ranking and sorting thing, how can we as scholars and instructors reflect citizenship, democracy, justice, experience, contributions, and reflection? How can we decolonize education is a big question for me. So how much of how we assess people in all different ways really is quite racist, it's sexist, it's ableist, it's classist. And I really want to move away from that. And I think it all starts with kind of where you are at home, right? Like where we start and what your own class is like. So we have to, institute the think globally, act locally kind of thing. So my next question for you, and this is anonymous, my next question for you is, what are you addicted to? And I'm going to put this in the chat too. And you'll be able to see, this is totally anonymous, I swear. I promise you that this is anonymous. So you can go to your answer garden, and I'm going to share that too. I'm just going to shift to answer garden. And like Frank, I've done this a version of this presentation before. So there are lots of answers here that I've kind of amalgamated. Many of them focus on substances like coffee, chocolate, wine, booze, things like that, gaming, online things like Twitter, things like that. So a lot of us are addicted also to, I'm seeing in here things I haven't seen before, like trying to get things right, perfectionism, stuff like that. And that probably speaks to a lot of who we are in this life as academics, right? Like we're all kind of the type A personality, but a lot of us are addicted to TV or weed or drinks or whatever. So I'm going to come back to, you can snoop on what everybody else is addicted to, because voyeurism is kind of fun. So we all know what many of us are addicted to now, but I want to suggest that we are addicted to grades. Grades tend to encourage people, whether it's faculty or students, to focus on the grade rather than the learning. Right? So even our learning management systems focus on grades. At my university, we use Canvas, and in Canvas is called speed grading. And if you go into the LMS gradebook, you'll see it's the same exact thing that we had. Do you remember when you were a kid and your teacher had that red book with everybody's names in horizontal lines, and he or she would fold the page over so that the grades would kind of coincide with the person's name? It's the same thing in Canvas. It's the same thing in Blackboard, this kind of stuff. So we're operating in a system that perpetuates this addiction. It's set up to cause and support and encourage this addiction. So, okay, I've done my soapbox on why grades are problematic. So, all right, now what? What do I do now? One of the biggest helpful tactics that I've taken on is detailed feedback. Like, I don't mean like, yeah, good job. I mean super detailed feedback, because research shows that students pay more attention to the grade than the feedback. So I just erased the grade and said, here's your feedback. And so immediately it lifted that sense of judgment, and students got the qualitative response rather than a quantitative one that felt like a ranking and a placement. So another thing I do is I let students create rubrics. If they are getting a grade, sometimes I, still give them sort of a feedback in terms of a level 1, 2, 3, 4, something like this. I let them create the rubric. So there's a sense of ownership around that, and a sense of clarity and agency around creating a rubric. So I encourage a collaborative rubric creation. Peer assessment sounds terrible. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to have to do peer assessment. It's actually so fun. My students said it was one of the best parts of this rearranged pandemic learning. So I have them submit work into our university Google Drive so that they all see each other's work. And some students were like, oh, I'm afraid, other students are going to see my work. I feel a little vulnerable. But it kind of upped the ante a little bit, and students got really into it and really enjoyed seeing each other's interpretations of the concepts that we were talking about in class. Another option is contract grading. To get an A, do this. To get a B, do this, and so on. Another option is self-assessment. I ask students to complete a self-assessment to accompany an assignment. So let's say they do some sort of project or presentation or something like this. You could even do it in STEM, like if they've got formulas to figure out or whatever. I ask them to do their self-assessment, and I ask them to kind of conceive of it as kind of a like an artist statement. So how did you meet the requirements of this assignment? Did you do anything different? Did you take any risks? Did you do anything unusual that worked or totally flopped or like totally didn't work? So what do I need to consider and what do you need to consider in assessing your own work? So I see it as kind of like a story or an artist statement that accompanies the work that students did. Another thing that I love doing, and a lot of my STEM colleagues are into this, is low stakes or no stakes assignments. Low stakes or no stakes, like, I don't know, it could be worth like 2% of your grade, or it's just like a freebie. Or if you do it, you get 100%. It's any kind of finagling of this kind of concept. So it could be a quiz, like sort of a formative assessment, like how much of this do you understand, right? So if then a student can go, actually, I totally don't get this. Or yeah, I'm on it. I got it. I'm ready to go to the next module or whatever it is. And then another thing I do with my students is a checkout at the end of the semester. I do this through Google Slides. That's how I kind of run it. Sorry, Google Forms. I ask them to describe their attendance, to describe their participation with their colleagues, describe their project, describe their weekly participation in our discussions, and so on. So I ask them to kind of report to me on that, and then we check out. So when I run these assignments with my students, I ask myself 3 questions. Is this assignment going to make my students more interesting at parties? I swear, and they love this because I want my students to be able to internalize this information and say, oh yeah, I learned about this when I was an undergrad, or I learned about this last semester, or whatever. What I want to do this assignment, and I do all of my assignments with all of my students, and I submit my examples in with all of theirs. And then my other more humorous one is, am I going to hate my life when I'm giving students feedback, right? Because it should be fun. Teaching should be fun, learning should be fun, and let's give students the opportunity to be creative. So a couple of just some comments that students had about the non-grading process. These are real unadulterated quotes from students, and including the misspellings. This is a little bit death by PowerPoint here, and I know I only have another moment until I finish, so I'm just wrapping up. This student said, I love this, and I'm going to love it until the day I die. This student said, in other courses, I focus on the grade, but in this course, I felt like I could succeed without pressure. This final comment, and this is my caveat here, is that students have gotten grades since elementary school, and some of them are really uncomfortable with that because they want to know where they stand. Am I doing better or worse than this person or that person? This kind of stuff. So that's one obstacle that we need to get through in terms of removing the ranking and sorting of students. They've always experienced that. So how can we make this more equitable? So one thing that I've really loved about doing this is that students or faculty, or I can see it on Twitter, like, oh, it's grading season, it's grading weeks or whatever. And I never say I'm grading my students. I always say I'm giving my students their feedback. And that's such a mental shift. Instead of like, ugh, I'm grading, it's, oh, I'm giving my students their feedback this week, that's what I'm doing.